In commercial aviation, the very first international customer can change absolutely everything for a struggling aircraft program. And right now, the Chinese-built COMAC C919 might be closer than it has ever been to crossing exactly that line. Fresh reports suggest a major Southeast Asian carrier is seriously weighing whether to fly the jet, a move that could crack open a market Boeing and Airbus have controlled for half a century. If this actually happens, it won't just be a footnote in an airline's fleet plan. It could mark the opening chapter of a genuinely new era in global aviation. So why would any airline take that kind of gamble? And what could it mean for Boeing's future? Let's get into it. To understand why a single potential order matters this much, we first need to look closely at the aircraft sitting at the center of this entire story. We're talking about the COMAC C919, a narrow-body airliner, developed by China's state-backed aerospace giant. For China, this jet represents one of the most ambitious industrial undertakings the country has ever attempted. Its mission is simple to describe and brutally difficult to execute. Go head-to-head with two of the most commercially successful aircraft families ever built, the Boeing 777X and the Airbus A350. Those two aircraft families dominate the entire global short and medium-haul market. Airlines depend on them to move passengers between major cities, regional airports, and busy economic centers all over the planet. This is the single largest and most heavily trafficked category in the entire commercial aviation industry, the segment where the greatest number of aircraft are sold, delivered, and flown every single year. By stepping into this category, the C919 is walking straight into one of the most fiercely contested and strategically important battlegrounds in all of aerospace. In terms of raw specifications, the aircraft sits comfortably in the same class as its Western rivals. Depending on the cabin configuration an airline chooses, it can carry somewhere between roughly 150 and 190 passengers. That capacity places it perfectly for the kind of flights that form the actual backbone of global commercial aviation, routes lasting a few hours that link large population centers with regional hubs. This is the workhorse category, the segment where reliability, fuel efficiency, and razor-thin operating economics decide whether an airline turns a profit or bleeds cash on every single flight. But this jet was never just another aircraft entering an already crowded field. For China, it represents something considerably larger than a product line. For decades, commercial aviation has been almost entirely dominated by Western manufacturers. Aircraft built by Boeing and Airbus simply became the default choice for airlines everywhere on Earth. By developing a genuinely competitive aircraft of its own, China gets the chance to build an entire domestic aerospace ecosystem, one that could eventually support its own airlines while also attracting customers from beyond its borders. In a lot of ways, the C919 program has already crossed a real milestone. The aircraft has entered commercial service and is now flying real passengers on real routes inside China. That alone is a legitimate achievement for a program this young. Passengers are boarding it. Airlines are folding it into their fleets, and the program keeps steadily expanding its footprint inside the domestic market. Even so, there remains one enormous obstacle standing between this jet and true global relevance. Despite all the attention the program has attracted, almost every single flight hour logged by the C919 has happened entirely within China's borders. Outside the country, airlines have remained cautious, watching from a distance rather than signing on the dotted line. In this industry, credibility is built largely on who operates an aircraft and where it actually flies. When the rest of the world sees a brand new jet successfully operated by international carriers, confidence in that program tends to grow rapidly. That is exactly why the next step for the C919 might be the most consequential one yet. If this aircraft is ever going to become a serious global competitor, it eventually needs the one thing every major aircraft program depends on: its first genuine international customer. And that is precisely why recent reports about a Southeast Asian airline evaluating the jet have suddenly captured the attention of the entire aviation world. If you were sitting in an airline executive's chair right now, would you take a chance on an unproven aircraft like the C919, or would you play it safe and stick with a proven workhorse like the 737 MAX? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is exactly the calculation being made in boardrooms right now. Up until this point, the C919 has operated almost exclusively inside China, which is precisely why this next development matters so much. According to recent industry reporting, one carrier in Southeast Asia is now seriously evaluating whether to bring the aircraft into its fleet. The airline at the center of that conversation is Malaysia Airlines. For the global aviation industry, this news landed immediately and hard. For years, the jet has remained locked almost entirely inside China's domestic market, with Chinese carriers as its only real operators and its international footprint staying essentially non-existent. That's exactly why the idea of a foreign carrier, even seriously considering the aircraft, represent such a significant moment in the program's overall trajectory. What makes this particular situation so interesting is how the airline itself has chosen to frame the evaluation publicly. In interviews, Malaysia Airlines executives have emphasized that they remain open to reviewing aircraft from any manufacturer on Earth. Their stated goal isn't to favor one country or one aerospace company over another. Instead, they say their focus rests squarely on the fundamentals that actually matter in this business: safety, operational reliability, and long-term commercial efficiency. For an airline operating in one of the most fiercely competitive regions in the world, those factors often carry far more weight than brand loyalty or geopolitical symbolism. This kind of open evaluation is standard practice in airline fleet planning. When carriers consider bringing new aircraft types into their operations, they typically run extensive multi-year assessments. These reviews cover everything from fuel burn and AM, maintenance cost to pilot and technician training requirements, and realistic delivery timelines. Airlines routinely compare several aircraft types side by side before committing to anything. In many cases, this entire process stretches out over years before a single purchase agreement gets signed. But even at this early evaluation stage, the fact that Malaysia Airlines is examining the jet at all carries real significance. This is one of the most recognizable and respected carriers in all of Southeast Asia, operating a network that stretches across Asia and well beyond it. Aviation analysts and rival carriers throughout the region watch its fleet decisions closely, almost as a bellwether. When an airline of this size and stature starts seriously considering a new aircraft program, it inevitably raises questions across the entire industry. And that brings us to the point that makes this story genuinely compelling. If Malaysia Airlines ultimately decided to move forward with an order, it wouldn't just be another routine fleet purchase. It could make the carrier one of the very first international operators of this aircraft outside Chinese airspace. In aviation, that kind of milestone carries enormous weight. The first airline to adopt a new jet in a fresh market often becomes the reference point that every other carrier watches carefully before making their own move. That's exactly why this evaluation has generated so much buzz among aviation observers. For COMAC, landing a genuine foreign customer would represent a massive leap toward real global credibility. And for Malaysia Airlines, this decision could suddenly place the carrier at the center of one of the most closely watched storylines in commercial aviation right now. So if Malaysia Airlines really is seriously evaluating the C919, the obvious next question becomes, why Malaysia and why now? The answer traces back to the rapid transformation happening across Southeast Asian aviation. Over roughly the past decade, air travel between China and the ASEAN nations has grown explosively. Tourism, trade, and business travel have all surged together, turning this corridor into one of the fastest growing aviation markets anywhere on the planet. For regional airlines, that growth represents a massive opportunity, but only if they actually have the aircraft available to capture it. Malaysia Airlines has been deliberately positioning itself at the heart of this expansion. The carrier has steadily increased its focus on routes connecting China with Southeast Asia, including service to cities like Chengdu, while actively exploring additional destinations such as Shenzhen. The broader strategic goal is straightforward: strengthen Kuala Lumpur's role as a regional hub funneling passenger traffic between China and the rest of ASEAN. In airline economics, hub strategies matter enormously because they let a carrier concentrate passengers from dozens of smaller origin points through a single central airport, creating dramatically more efficient networks and higher overall passenger volumes. But building that kind of network requires one essential resource above everything else: enough aircraft. Airlines simply cannot launch new routes or increase flight frequency without a growing fleet to support it. And right now, that has become a genuine industry-wide bottleneck. Boeing and Airbus, the two dominant manufacturers, are both sitting on massive order backlogs. Their most popular models, the 737MAX and the A320neo, are frequently sold out years into the future, forcing airlines to wait a very long time for fresh deliveries. This is exactly where a newcomer like COMAC could find an opening. According to airline executives familiar with the discussions, one potential advantage of the C919 is earlier delivery availability compared to the Western manufacturers. In a market where carriers are desperate to grow quickly, getting aircraft sooner rather than later can be an enormously powerful incentive, sometimes powerful enough to outweigh brand familiarity. That reality helps explain why Southeast Asia, and Malaysia specifically, has suddenly become such an important proving ground for this aircraft's future. If the C919 does enter service with a genuine international carrier, it could trigger a ripple effect across the entire industry. Airlines watch each other's fleet decisions extremely closely, and when one carrier successfully operates a new aircraft type without major issues, others begin viewing it as a proven, de-risked option rather than an unpredictable gamble. That's exactly what makes a potential move by Malaysia Airlines so significant. If the carrier introduces the jet and runs it well, It sends an unmistakable signal that the aircraft can genuinely perform outside the protective bubble of China's domestic market. That kind of validation can shift industry perception remarkably fast, especially in regions where airlines are actively hunting for additional capacity. And those regions matter enormously. Markets across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and other rapidly developing regions are all expanding quickly, with rising demand for exactly the kind of short and medium haul flights this aircraft category serves. These also happen to be the exact markets where the 737 MAX and A320neos currently reign supreme. For decades, those two families have effectively defined the entire global narrow-body segment. Landing one international customer won't immediately dismantle that dominance. Boeing and Airbus still command enormous global support ecosystems, thousands of aircraft already in active service, and deep, decades-long relationships with airlines everywhere. But that isn't really where the true impact of this story lies. In fast-growing markets desperate for new capacity, even a small foothold could mark the beginning of something much larger down the road. So why would China even attempt this uphill climb? Why risk billions chasing a dream that has already buried so many other national aviation ambitions? The answer comes down to two words: survival and sovereignty. For Beijing, being the second largest aviation market on the planet while remaining almost entirely dependent on Western-built aircraft represented a genuine strategic vulnerability. This was never just about wanting to build an airplane. China needed a shield against future sanctions and a seat at the high-stakes table of global industrial power. That is exactly where COMAC enters the picture. Established in 2008, this was never simply another aerospace company. It was conceived from the beginning as a national mission. The birth of the C919 turned into a grueling, emotionally exhausting marathon. Nothing like the overnight success story the headlines sometimes suggest. It was a 15-year grind packed with missed deadlines, brutal certification hurdles, and the constant mounting pressure of proving to a deeply skeptical world that an aircraft made in China could still mean safe for their families. When the first C919 finally touched down in Shanghai on its maiden commercial flight back in 2023, it wasn't purely a technical milestone. It was a genuine roar of national pride. China had finally built a full-size commercial workhorse capable of carrying around 160 passengers, directly challenging both the A320 and the 737 in the process. But how exactly does a newcomer survive inside a market where trust means everything and the incumbents already carry a 50-year head start? To understand that, we have to look past the wings and engines entirely, toward a far more subtle and almost invisible advantage China holds over its Western rivals. In the high-stakes world of aerospace, time isn't just money, it behaves more like a predator, stalking every private manufacturer. If you're a publicly traded company like Boeing or Airbus, you live and die by the quarterly earnings report. Shareholders demand profits now, not in 15 years. COMAC, on the other hand, operates on a fundamentally different clock. It has access to what analysts often call patient capital, and that isn't just a polished financial term. It's the genuine superpower that let China stare down 15 straight years of delays, technical setbacks, and a punishing learning curve without ever seriously considering pulling the plug. Think about the sheer emotional weight of those early years. In the beginning, everything was pure survival mode. Engineers weren't remotely concerned with cabin lighting or bin design. They were fighting for the program's actual existence, battling relentless skepticism about their supply chains and grappling with the staggering complexity of certifying every single bolt against rigorous international safety standards. A private company facing that same pressure might well have pulled the plug to protect its stock price. But the Chinese state kept the funding flowing regardless. They weren't focused on the next fiscal quarter. They were focused on the next 30 years. But even with unlimited money and confidence behind it, can any aircraft truly be called independent if its single most critical component still comes entirely from the West? On the surface, this jet looks like a genuine triumph of Chinese engineering. Underneath, though, it's still breathing with Western lungs. Every single C919 currently in the sky flies on the CFM LEAP 1C, an engineering masterpiece built by a joint venture between American and French manufacturers. This is China's genuine Achilles heel. Imagine spending 15 years constructing an impenetrable fortress, only to realize that the key to the front door still belongs to someone else entirely. If trade relations sour further or export controls tighten unexpectedly, this program doesn't merely slow down. It could grind to a complete halt. China is fully aware of this exposure, which is exactly why it's pouring enormous resources into the CJ1000A, its homegrown answer to the LEAP engine. But here's the cold, unavoidable truth. You cannot shortcut physics. A modern jet engine operates at temperatures hotter than the melting point of its own turbine blades. It has to survive bird strikes, hailstorms, and thousands upon thousands of hours of continuous vibration without a single catastrophic failure anywhere along the way. Western giants like GE Aerospace and Rolls-Royce have spent 50 years perfecting this genuinely difficult branch of material science. For China, catching up isn't purely about throwing money at the problem. It requires the kind of hard-won wisdom that only comes from decades of things quietly going wrong in a lab. So, what exactly is China doing about it? Not waiting around, that much is clear. The CJ1000A has already completed its first round of ground testing, and Beijing has reportedly set an internal deadline: a fully certified domestic engine before 2030. More tellingly, they're leaning on the exact same playbook that built the airframe itself: heavy state. Funding, captive domestic airlines serving as test operators, and zero immediate pressure to turn a profit. Independent analysts remain cautiously skeptical, with most estimating the engine won't be genuinely ready for commercial prime time until sometime in the early 2030s. But the overall trajectory is unmistakable. Every year that passes, the Western grip on China's aviation heartbeat loosens just a little bit further. And even if the engine problem eventually gets solved, there's a second obstacle that's just as formidable and receives far less public attention. Roughly half of the world's commercial aircraft aren't actually owned outright by the airlines flying them. They're owned by massive leasing giants like AerCap and Air Lease Corporation, the true bankers of the sky. Their business logic is brutally simple. If an airline defaults on payments, the leasing company needs to be able to repossess that aircraft and place it with a completely different operator anywhere in the world with minimal friction. For a 737, that process is entirely routine. Because certified mechanics and readily available, spare parts exist in essentially every major city on Earth. For the C919, that same question suddenly becomes uncomfortable outside China's borders. Who else is actually equipped to take this plane? Without an established global maintenance network and a proven secondary resale market, the aircraft's residual value collapses, and cautious lessors simply won't touch it. This is exactly where the story turns genuinely uncomfortable for Boeing and Airbus. For decades, both manufacturers treated China as something close to a golden goose, a massive and remarkably reliable stream of orders that fueled years of sustained growth. They largely assumed that because China couldn't build a fully global maintenance and support network overnight, they would remain the only realistic game in town indefinitely. That assumption is looking shakier by the year. The real humiliation here isn't just about a single airplane program. It's about a deeper strategic asymmetry. While Boeing and Airbus have to fight for every single order in an open global marketplace, COMAC enjoys something neither competitor has ever had: a genuinely captive domestic audience. China is projected to need roughly 8,800 new jets over the next 20 years, a market worth close to $1 trillion, and Beijing has effectively decided to reserve the largest slices of that pie for itself. By directing its 3 enormous state-owned carriers to prioritize the C919 on domestic routes, China is quietly starving the Western duopoly of thousands of potential future orders. Run the math for a moment. If China redirects even 40% of its domestic narrow-body demand toward COMAC, that translates into billions upon billions of dollars, simply vanishing from Boeing and Airbus's long-term revenue projections, permanently. But the impact runs deeper still. Every single hour a C919 spends flying between cities like Shanghai and Beijing, it isn't just transporting passengers from one gate to another. It's quietly accumulating the one resource Boeing and Airbus have always valued above almost everything else: real-world operational data and flight experience. By the time COMAC is finally ready to export this aircraft at meaningful scale sometime in the 2030s, it won't be walking onto the world stage as a nervous newcomer. It will already have millions of accumulated flight hours, a refined and battle-tested supply chain, and a genuine operational track record, all built and perfected entirely within its own borders. A former Boeing chief executive admitted this openly and directly. COMAC represents a genuine long-term threat, not necessarily because the aircraft itself is already superior, but because China is playing a patient game measured in decades, while the West remains locked into a game measured in quarterly earnings calls. Beijing has effectively turned the world's single most lucrative aviation market into a fortress the West no longer fully controls. Meanwhile, the pressure isn't staying purely internal to China. According to industry reporting, Beijing has also been quietly leaning on Airbus specifically, allowing a substantial backlog of A350 delivery certifications to sit stalled in bureaucratic limbo, even as Chinese airlines desperately need the aircraft. It's a calculated, deliberate slow walk rather than any genuine shortage of demand, and reports suggest it's tied directly to how quickly Europe's aviation safety regulator moves on certifying the C919 for international operations. Airbus has poured billions into its Tianjin assembly line inside China, and if that certification standoff drags on much longer, the entire production line risks grinding to a costly halt. It's a remarkably blunt piece of leverage. Cooperate on fast-tracking our jet's global certification, or watch your own delivery pipeline stall out indefinitely. And Boeing hasn't been sitting entirely on the sidelines of this drama either. After years of frozen relations following the 737 MAX grounding, tariffs, export restrictions, and a trade war that shut down new orders almost entirely, Boeing's own chief executive recently traveled to Beijing as part of a broader diplomatic delegation, and analysts are now watching closely for what could become the largest Chinese order Boeing has landed since 2017. China's own aviation market has kept exploding regardless of any of these tensions, with Chinese airlines carrying north of 700 million passengers in a single recent year, a figure still climbing sharply. Airbus, for its part, simply cannot produce aircraft fast enough to keep pace with that demand, and COMAC, for all its genuine progress, still isn't delivering anywhere near the volume required to fill the gap on its own. That leaves China caught in a bind nobody fully planned for: explosive demand, an overwhelmed Airbus, an ambitious but still maturing COMAC, and Boeing, the manufacturer Beijing spent years actively trying to move away from, still standing as one of the only players with the production capacity to help. So where does this leave Malaysia Airlines and the broader question of who actually ends up flying the C919 next? The truth is that this single evaluation, however it ultimately resolves, sits right at the intersection of every thread running through this entire story. It's about whether COMAC can finally prove itself beyond China's borders. It's about whether Boeing and Airbus can hold their ground in the fastest growing aviation corridor on the planet. And it's about whether an entirely new third player can genuinely earn a permanent seat at a table that has only ever sat two. Would you feel comfortable boarding a C919 today, flying under a Southeast Asian carrier's colors rather than a Chinese domestic one? Or does the trust gap still feel far too wide to cross comfortably? Drop your take in the comments, and if you enjoy these kinds of deep dives into where aviation, business, and geopolitics collide, make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter of this rivalry between Boeing, Airbus, and COMAC is already unfolding in real time.